Marissa has made strong ties and fostered deep relationships with fellow feminists and women rights defenders around the world. She has worked with local women leaders in different communities and taught English as a second language to women and children in Nepal, Kenya, and Italy. Marissa lived in Italy for a number of years where her experiences supporting sex trafficking survivors began. She's held long-lasting and loyal friendships with survivors of human trafficking and gender-based violence around the world and believes the sisterhood can help heal immense and extreme trauma. After a long time away from home, Marissa returned to Canada in 2013 and founded Aura Freedom International, plunging headfirst into projects and programs addressing gender-based violence and sexual exploitation. Marissa Kokkoros is the executive director of Aura Freedom and is providing an awareness session today of domestic sex trafficking in Canada. Learn about the root causes of human trafficking, how it happens, who is targeted, and just how long of a road it is until we see the true eradication of human trafficking. The stage is yours.
It's on? Okay. Thank you so much. That opening ritual really filled my cup. I wasn't expecting that, maybe because I'm a little tired this morning with the big 1 hour change. But the joys and concerns was a really cool way to, I think, start my day. And it's something I might bring into some workshops later on. I might borrow that, and I'll cite the congregation as my inspiration for that. But it was really cool. And again, it really filled my cup. So I was wondering how to bring a domestic sex trafficking awareness session to such a group. And I was thinking of ways to, introduce the information in a way that would not be too triggering. But it was impossible for me to do because human trafficking is a very horrific human rights abuse. And so what I do want to say first before we start is that today's presentation will be distressing or can be distressing at times. And I will not show anything graphic or talk about anything graphic, but just the material itself. When we talk about fellow human beings being exploited and being harmed, and children and youth being harmed, it's distressing. So please take care of yourself. And those community resources, Janice, thank you for sharing those. Because, if you do need to reach out after, it might be a good idea to debrief with someone later. Just talk about, that was really interesting, or that was awful, or I didn't know that. And I think debriefing is something we do as a team at Aura Freedom. Because the work we do is very heavy, and I think you can also do it with your own community. Aura Freedom is a grassroots women's organization. We started in 2013. It's our 10-year anniversary, so we're thinking about something lovely to do this year for our 10-year anniversary, involving art and music and some awareness, but mostly a celebration. But what we do is we implement education and knowledge sharing, advocacy, research, policy change to eventually, and our North Star is the eradication of all forms of violence against women and girls. And we do that through many different initiatives. In terms of human trafficking, we've consulted for various levels of government for anti-trafficking efforts and strategies. We've trained numerous frontline agencies and just community members, police, rape crisis center, school boards that we are currently working with, and we're a member of a number of international and national coalitions addressing human trafficking around the world. And this is an area of, it's one form of violence against women that we spend a lot of time working on. 2 years ago, we won the Mayor's Award from the City of Toronto for our work preventing youth sex trafficking in Toronto. So it was a big day for our team. And you can check out our website for But I will keep it simple today. Before we start, we're going to talk about the way we address human trafficking and things we have learned along the way. I learn every day. I still don't know everything there is to know about the complex human rights abuse of human trafficking. But there's a quote by Desmond Tutu that really guides my work and guides the work that we do at Aura Freedom. And it's this one right here. And it says there comes a point where we need to stop just pulling people out of the river. We need to go upstream and find out why they're falling in. And, you know, this is a really great way of describing Aura Freedom's method of addressing human trafficking. Rescue and response is definitely necessary. But at that point, the trauma that has ripped through that person's life and their family and everyone around them, it's so horrific that it takes a lifetime to heal, to find healing, peace, redemption. And so what we do is we educate and train and work on prevention. So we're upstream. That's where you'll always find Aura Freedom is upstream. I've done a lot of frontline work downstream, and that's where the expertise, I guess, comes in and really understanding the nuances of sex trafficking. But we look at the root causes of human trafficking. It's really hard to exploit someone who is enjoying a life of good health, whose basic needs are met, who has a great community around them and love. You can't. The trafficker will just move on to someone else who they don't have to spend so much time on. It's really hard to traffic an empowered youth, an empowered young person. And so this is really the key to our way of preventing human trafficking. So we address systemic racism, poverty and ableism, classism, and homo and transphobia, patriarchy, colonialism, and most of all, gender inequality, because about 97% of sex trafficking victims and survivors are girls and women. We also employ a non-punishment principle, and this is where it gets tricky with the police, because human trafficking is a crime, and it is a crime, but most importantly, it's a human rights abuse. If we focus on crime, then we're focusing on all the crimes that many of the young girls are forced to commit while they're being trafficked. They might have to carry guns and drugs and arms for their pimp or their trafficker. They have petty crimes and fraud, credit card fraud under their name. And so we don't focus on crime. We take a non-punishment principle approach. This is actually a UN principle, and it's still not employed in our communities. Many survivors, after going through their trafficking experience, are criminalized afterwards. So what is sex trafficking? We're going to take a look at domestic sex trafficking in Canada and how it happens and who it happens to. I do have some definitions and stats here. These are Canadian stats. So 97% of victims are girls and young women. As I mentioned, many of them are under 18, about 30%. And 92% knew their trafficker beforehand. So today I'm going to dispel the boogeyman myth and the myth of being abducted into a situation of human trafficking, which is what Hollywood shows us, but it's really not the way it happens. So that video is actually a Government of Canada, federal government video, and around the time when all of our grassroots organizations were consulting for the human trafficking national strategy, they were also looking at a public awareness campaign to kind of dispel the myths. And it's actually a pretty well done video. And that is a typical look at domestic sex trafficking in Canada. It's most often, did you have a question? Oh, okay. It's most often someone that the young person knows. And I am going to, say women and girls, but that doesn't mean that young men and boys can't be trafficked or exploited. It's just the population that Aura Freedom works with. And it doesn't mean that gender diverse youth aren't exploited either. But the typical is the Romeo trafficker and the boyfriend or the best friend. And we do also have familial trafficking. So the problem with rescue narratives of sex trafficking, what could be a problem with a rescue narrative of sex trafficking? That means where someone is kidnapped, put into a van, driven across the Mexican border, and then, like we see in the movie Taken with Liam Neeson, right? What could be the problem with that image? The problem is when that is the image that we see on social media about sex trafficking, and when that is the image that youth see about sex trafficking in Hollywood, when they're starting to be exploited in the real way that it happens, they're not going to recognize it as exploitation in the beginning, and they won't reach out for help because they're going to say, my trafficking situation looks nothing like this. And so Aura Freedom works a lot with youth and with school boards in dispelling some of these myths. So that's one social media video that was made for a youth symposium that we did, but we do a lot of that work. So yeah, human trafficking looks nothing like it does in Hollywood. It actually looks completely different in real life. It rarely involves kidnapping and abduction, and I'm not saying that those situations never happen, but they are a very small percentage of the cases. I've personally never worked with a youth who was kidnapped or abducted into their situation of trafficking or into their sex exploitation. Don't think international. Most traffickers and trafficked persons in Canada are Canadian. They're Canadian citizens. And traffickers are not strangers. In most cases, and remember that 93% of cases, or 92, the person knew their trafficker beforehand. Survivors are not tied up. They're not gagged and bound. The chains are here. And so we're going to talk a little bit more later on, but the door is wide open for many of these youth and young girls and women to leave, but they can't for many, many reasons. Traffickers are most often close to home, if not in the home, and that is with familial trafficking, but intimate partners or boyfriends, people posing as intimate partners, friends and acquaintances, and peer-to-peer recruitment. So very often I'll work with the young girl or youth who, as part of her exploitation, has to recruit others for her trafficker. If she doesn't, there will be a price to pay. If she doesn't, she won't be in his favor or her favor. And when you're not in your trafficker's favor, life is hard. And so recruitment is part of the exploitation process, and it's really hard to accept, but it's survival. And so recruitment, peer-to-peer recruitment happens, sometimes at the school level, sometimes in group homes with youth in foster care. Still to date, that video you just saw, the Romeo trafficker is the most common still to date of trafficking situations, but it doesn't mean it's the only one. We're going to use this slide because we're doing a quick version today. But there is a very, very intricate luring and grooming process. And the traffickers know this process very well. And traffickers aren't smarter than you and I, but they are very cunning. And what they are very good at is choosing in the room who the best person to exploit is. And so that's step one, is targeting someone to exploit. The trafficker will find the crack in the surface of the victim, whatever that crack may be, whether it's a youth who's been kicked out of their house because they said they were gay, whether it's an Indigenous youth who has systemic issues facing them and no community support due to intergenerational trauma and poverty, whether it's just a young girl who doesn't like the way she looks, and our society says that it's the most important thing. So whatever that crack is, kids in care are some of the highest at risk, which puts a lot of Indigenous youth at risk. But they will find the crack and they will find that need to fill. They need to find out what need they're going to fill later. Step two is gaining trust and info. You got to gain trust of the person you're going to exploit. Now, this is almost all online. Okay, so the targeting is happening online. The luring and grooming is happening online. Youth are being lured and groomed online by traffickers and their associates. They're all traffickers, really. But again, there's a lot of recruitment happening, and many of the people recruiting are being exploited. It's extremely complex, but we have to understand that. And so you're going to gain trust and info. Who's your family? What do they do? Where does your little brother play after school? I want to find out everything, and I'm going to find that out, and I'm going to get all the info I need later to threaten you with. And then I'm going to fill a need. I'm going to find out what that need is you need filled. Is it love? This stage is the love bombing stage. It's the most beautiful time in a young person's life before they start being exploited. I've worked with young girls who have told me the amount of joy and love I felt in that stage, I still am unable to get there. I'm unable to feel that amount of joy because it's gifts, it's traveling, it's promising you the stars. And it is too good to be true. If something looks too good to be true, it is, especially in these types of situations. And so money, gifts, new phones, nails done, love, acceptance if you're from a community that's not accepted, validating all those fears, taking something small about perhaps your family that you're not happy with and completely blowing it out of proportion, alienating them. For step 4, isolation. It's easy to isolate someone now who is having a great time and trusts you. And it's a lot easier to isolate them, and now they're going to start vilifying anyone who could give a damn about them. They're going to say, no, they're not good. They're not a good person. They're out to get you. Very similar to a cult, the way a cult works. And then the abuse begins. This is coercive control and abuse. It is psychological control. It is physical and sexual abuse. It is humiliation, mortification in front of others. It is really hard. And then you maintain that control. And that's why I said earlier, those chains are up here. Like the door is open. And when I say the door is open, it really is. But they are not able to step out and walk out. And we see these similar cycles with domestic violence. And how it really is many of the survivors, at least that I've worked with, didn't even know that they were being trafficked until later on. You can see from that video where she just thought she was in a relationship. There were red flags, but the coercive control is helping her ignore the red flags because the cycle will start again. So there's going to be a honeymoon stage, tension building, explosion, calm. Honeymoon stage, tension building, explosion, calm. And this cycle repeats itself. And trauma bonds are formed in this way. Trauma bonds with the trafficker. So that Stockholm syndrome, it is a thing also with sex trafficking. The biggest thing we do at Aura Freedom is call attention to the root causes, because if we're not upstream, then we're always downstream, pulling youth out of the river. And that's not what we want to do. And so we take a deep dive when we do, day-long workshops and trainings. We take a deep dive into the different root causes. The targeted communities are girls and women, Indigenous girls and youth. I will say that out of 4% of Indigenous women represent 4% of the population in Canada, and over 50% of sex trafficking survivors. So just think about that number. And when you think of how many Indigenous youth are in care, and kids in care are one of the prime targets for traffickers, then it's no wonder why there is the overrepresentation of Indigenous women and girls in sex trafficking situations. Black girls and youth as well, and other children in marginalized communities and facing systemic racism and systemic discrimination, and gender diverse youth. So what does all this have to do with trafficking? What are these root causes? We're speaking about racism, and we're speaking about homophobia, and we're speaking about feminism. Well, again, it's really hard to exploit someone who is enjoying a life of equality and health and all the basic needs met and those things. So just knowing the root causes of exploitation sometimes, when we do this with youth, is enough for them to feel valued. And when you feel valued and feel empowered, it's harder to exploit you. And so we work as well on building youth up, not just telling them the information of what sex trafficking looks like, but building them up so that they can live lives free from violence. So in the simplest of terms, ending human trafficking is easier than you think. Advocating for gender equality is ending human trafficking. Many times, community members will say, what can I do? With the means that I have, or in my community, or at my age, or at my place of work, what can I do? It's really simple. If you look upstream, being anti-racist is ending human trafficking. Learning about the genocide of Indigenous peoples is ending human trafficking. Supporting any disadvantaged young girl or woman is ending human trafficking. And speaking out against hate and homophobia is ending human trafficking. It's a manifestation of inequity. Human trafficking is the manifestation of it. And so when we work to advance equality and equity, we are working towards the eradication of all exploitation. But that doesn't mean that we stereotype and put our blinders on. So when I do this with the gender-based violence sector, so with women's shelters and such, they say, okay, now I see a youth in foster care, so I know they're probably going to be sex trafficked. And that's not always the case. Or I see an Indigenous youth and I know that they are going to have this, they might have this problem in their life. So we don't want to stereotype. We just want to be aware of the risks and the risk factors. That balance is a challenge because anyone can be trafficked. I've worked with a lot of youth from affluent neighborhoods who were trafficked in just the same horrific way. And so we have to just make sure we don't have blinders on. I talked about coercive control. This is not a coercive control training, but here's some of our slides on that. But really, coercive control is really hard to see. You can't point to it. Physical violence is easy to point to, but coercive control is a pattern, an ongoing pattern of relentless psychological terror and abuse. And it's hard to see. And so when, even frontline workers, when I give training, say, but, she just keeps going back. And so we have to flip the script from why doesn't she just leave to understanding coercive control. Why doesn't she just leave? There's so many reasons. Here's a fraction of the reasons why on this slide. But there are many reasons why exploited people don't leave, can't leave, won't leave. And so what we have to do is create environments for them where leaving is easier than staying. And it's really hard. So traffickers preying upon the need for approval, attachment, love, and community, trauma bonds, as I mentioned, physical and sexual violence, the threats of violence to your loved ones. Who wouldn't stay in a situation if they knew that someone in their family was going to be harmed? You know, many of us would. Debt bondage, peer-to-peer recruitment. Well, now you're a trafficker too, right? I made you a monster. So where are you going? The world is not going to accept you. You're a criminal. And it's deep. And so these are some of the answers, and we must recognize that when we're working with trafficked persons, we're probably going to come across things that they've done in their past that would be considered criminal activity. And that's why we employ the non-punishment principle. I'm not saying it's easy. It's hard for me to speak to young girls that are trafficking others. A big part of my heart wants to say, you know what that hell was like. And you're doing it to someone else, but this is her survival. Either she does this or she takes more clients herself. Either she does this or someone she loves will be harmed. Either she does this or she will be harmed. So many of us would do the same thing, if not all of us. And fear and stigma keeps survivors and victims right where they are. Fear of who's going to love me after this? What community will embrace me after this? How will I ever get a regular job? How will I ever get clean? How will I, accomplish or achieve anything in this world? So I want to just end with some quotes from survivors that we've supported at Or Freedom. And then I have a couple more things after that, and then some question and answer, right, Janice? Okay. I just realized I could walk around with this thing. I was like, the whole time. Okay, so I yes, I know. But just for the bending, I do want to say that there is joy. There still is joy after trafficking and after abuse, and many of the survivors I've worked with continue to astonish me with their grit and their strength, really. And many of us doing this work have experienced gender-based violence at least once in our lives. And so as survivors, that sisterhood that was mentioned in my biography is really something that is healing. So it's goodness. They do experience goodness again. And I wanted to leave some time for Q&A. I kept it really, really brief. And I do want to say, again, if you want to debrief later, I gave you a lot of information. Sometimes you'll walk out saying, well, that wasn't too bad, but then things will pop up later at night or in the morning when you're getting up and it's quiet. And again, just work through that and be mindful of your feelings. So I have, I just wanted to mention we have a human trafficking info hub on our website. It's the first grassroots info hub of its kind in Canada. It was created all with grassroots research and community research. We launched it last year, and it's been up for about a year now. We get over 1,000 website hits a month on it. It's been being used by community members, leadership. So check it out. And we also have a GBV resource center. GBV means gender-based violence, and a Get Help page with a lot of different resources for women experiencing violence in Toronto and in Canada more widely. And I will leave it there.
Wow.
Thank you. Thank you to everyone on Zoom.
Okay, we will